This is Irene Woods. This is the support video in the series for making the Midgauge Fairisle round yoke cardigan. And in this lesson we are going to work on bands. Now, there's not always a foolproof way to figure how many stitches you need. In general, we pick up 3 stitches for every 4 rows along a vertical edge, and usually that works out well. Occasionally it does not. And I found that in this pattern, on the stockinet side, I could pick up 3 stitches per every 4 rows, and it worked out just right. You want the band to be flat. You don't want it to bow in this way. If it does, that means you don't have enough stitches, but neither do you want it to bow out this way or to ruffle and flute up and down along the side. If that should happen, it means you have too many stitches. In this case, 3 stitches for every 4 rows worked out perfectly in the stockinet. I did find, though, that when I got into the round yoke, I needed to switch to picking up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. This is my gauge swatch. I like a fairly generous one, particularly when I get to larger sizes, because sometimes if the gauge is off just a little bit, the sweater's not going to fit right. The band on this side is the button band, and I will be putting a buttonhole band on this side in the future part of this video. Before we get into making the buttonholes, I'd like to talk a little bit about the buttons themselves. This is one of my smaller metal buttons. This is one of my larger ones. And when it came to man-made buttons, I don't have very many on hand. So the choice really came down to one of those. Now, they would work, and I can see instances where I might want to use them, especially if I had some black in the Fairisle, but I don't. And I think out of all the choices I have, this is the one I prefer. This one, I like the design, but it's just too small for the band. The buttons really, even these, are just a little small for the width of the band. We're about right at 1.3 centimeters. Now, if we do this as an inch measurement, and that looks to be approximately 7/8 of an inch. So these are relatively large buttons. You could certainly go up one more size and it would work on a band this big. The object is to keep the buttons in proportion, relatively in proportion at least, to the width of the band. We're now going to make buttonholes. I'm going to show you a 2-stitch version and a 3-stitch version. Buttonholes tend to stretch. They do no matter how you construct them. They just simply stretch. So I prefer to start with one that's a little bit tight, because after it's used just a very few times, it's going to stretch out. And it's relatively thick. It has a loop on the back, and I prefer buttons that have that on a sweater because it makes the button itself stand up away from the fabric just enough that the buttonhole can close underneath the button a little better. So bear in mind, this is a fairly large buttonhole, and we'll see whether the 2-stitch or the 3-stitch works better. I'm on the row where we're going to make the buttonholes. Now, since this isn't an actual garment, it's the same swatch that I used for the button band side a while ago. We're just simply going to space the buttons, the buttonholes, wherever. 2 stitches, 2 stitches, 3 stitches, and 3 stitches. And that should be enough for a really good test. Cut a length of pearl cotton, bedspread weight cotton, or just use ravel cord. I like to use short pieces of a bedspread weight cotton because they're easy to pull out afterwards. Manually knit each section through those marked needles. Be sure those latches are open. If they're not, you'll more than likely have a drop stitch, and that's something we don't want to do. Okay, I have 6 rows in the band to this point, so I'm going to knit another 6 rows. Now I knit 1 loose row. I'm going to turn the tension dial up 2 full numbers to 8. Okay, now I only did 5 rows after that loose row. Usually that works out just about right. What I'm doing is bringing the same needles that we used for the buttonhole back out just far enough that I can see them. And at this point we can see this was the top of the buttonhole, but now instead of 2 loops we have 3. 1, 2, 3. That's just the nature of the way stockinet is made. It will always do that. Pick up that first stitch, put it in the needle on the right. The original stitch is behind the latch, and this new loop is in the hook. Take it back to knit through. You're down to 1 stitch on the needle. Transfer it to the left needle. There are 2 stitches now on that left needle. Put them both behind the latch. Pick up the next loop from the top of the buttonhole. The latch closed, so I'm going to have to be careful with that. But make sure this stitch goes in the hook and these 2 are still behind the latch. Take that new stitch all the way through and then transfer to the needle on the left. Now pick up the 3rd loop from the top of the buttonhole. Put both of those 2 stitches behind the latch, and then this one goes in the hook, and knit it through. Now pick up the 2 stitches from the bottom side of the buttonhole and put them on the empty needles. Let's do that one more time. We have 2 needles forward to mark the space for the buttonhole. And you can see 1, 2, 3 loops. So take the loop on the right, put it in the first needle, and knit it through. Transfer that stitch to the left. Put both stitches behind the latch. Pick up the next loop from the top of the buttonhole. into the hook of the needle and knit it through, and then transfer that stitch to the left. Pick up the third loop from the top of the buttonhole into the hook of the needle and knit through. Pick up the 2 stitches from the bottom side of the buttonhole onto the empty needles. Now we're to the 3-stitch buttonhole, and we have 4 loops. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pick up the first one into the first needle on the right, knit it through. Transfer the stitch. Make sure they are both behind the latch. Pick up the next loop from the top of the buttonhole into the hook of the needle and knit through. Transfer this stitch to the left. Both stitches behind the latch. Pick up the third loop from the top of the buttonhole and knit through. Transfer the stitch. Pick up the 4th loop from the top of the buttonhole. I'm not sure those are behind the latch. They're not. And knit through. Now pick up the 3 loops from the bottom of the buttonhole onto the empty needles. And that's one of the 3-stitch buttonholes. We'll do this one more time. Pick up the first loop on the right into the first needle and knit it through. Transfer the stitch. Make sure they're both behind the latch. Pick up the next stitch from the top of the buttonhole into the hook of the needle and knit it through. Transfer the stitch. Pick up the next loop. Knit it through. Pick up the next loop into the hook of the needle and knit it through. Pick up the bottom stitches of the buttonhole. Now, I always bring the needles forward. It just prevents drop stitches. We need 6 rows. Turn the tension dial up as high as it will go. In this case, on this machine, it's 9. Knit 1 row. And then bind off using the stitch through stitch method. Basically what you're doing is pulling stitches through each other. And I will complete this off camera, and then I'll be back. Pull out the waste yarn. This is why I like short pieces. You can, of course, use one whole length of ravel cord and just do each one across consecutively if you want to do that. Now this is what it looks like on the inside. This is what they look like on the outside. Sometimes the yarn kind of sticks to itself, and this yarn's pretty bad for that. It's got enough wool that it's kind of grabby. Okay, this is the wrong side. And this is the public side. Now let's test the button. Okay, this was the 2-stitch buttonhole, and that goes through. It's stretching it just a little bit, but it goes through. Okay. And I'm not having to put any force on it, it just slides right through. Okay, this is the 3-stitch buttonhole. Oh, we've got a little bit caught there. It's a judgment call, would be for me in this case. It's possible that this 3-stitch buttonhole would be okay with this particular button. The button goes through a little easier, but I would still be concerned that after these are buttoned a few times, they may stretch. The next thing that I would take into consideration is, does the buttonhole show at all around the button? And it doesn't, not even on the 3-stitch one. When you slide the button back and forth, it does just a little bit. And normally, when you are wearing a garment, this is a thing that we learn from sewing. Not so much taught in knit classes, but sewing courses will tell you to make sure that when you sew the button on, that it goes towards the top end of the buttonhole. The reason being, when you wear the garment, if you've sewn the buttonhole, if you've sewn the button so that it's at the bottom of the buttonhole, gravity is simply going to pull it down this way anyhow. So in order to keep things matched up, we just simply always sew so that the button ends up at the top of the hole.